This is another iRaw podcast. We podcast to make the world a better place for animals.
It's both kind and rational to like knowing animals. I can't deny it's fashionable to like knowing animals.
Hello everyone and welcome to Knowing Animals. Knowing Animals is a podcast in which we speak to animal studies scholars about a piece of their work. I'm Josh Milburn and I do like knowing animals. This episode of Knowing Animals is brought to you by ASA, that's A-A-S-A, the Australasian Animal Studies Association. I've just renewed my membership and I encourage you to become members too. Membership is very reasonably priced. The episode is also brought to you by the Animal Publics book series from Sydney University Press. This is a collection of scholarly books focused on animal studies. The series is currently accepting applications, so if you're writing a book on animal studies and you're wondering whether it might be a good fit, I encourage you to get in touch with the editors. Also, a quick shout out to Elizabeth Usher, who provided the updated theme tune for Knowing Animals. To learn more about Elizabeth's work, visit veganthused.com. For today's episode, I'm very pleased to introduce Professor Chris Hopwood, who is a Professor of Personality Psychology in the Department of Psychology at the University of Zurich in Switzerland. He and his team are very interested in the psychology of human interactions with animals, including especially the psychology of diet, including personality differences between people who eat meat and people who do not. He's the co-founder of the Society for the Psychology of Human-Animal Intergroup Relations, also called PHAIR, spelled P-H-A-I-R, as well as the editor of the Society's journal, which is also called PHAIR. And we'll talk a little about both later in the podcast. First, however, we're going to talk about Chris's 2021 paper, Development and Validation of the Motivations to Eat Meat Inventory, which was published open access in the journal Appetite and co-authored with Jared Piazza, Sophia Chen and Wiebke Bleidorn. Welcome to the podcast, Chris.
Thanks, Josh. I love the podcast. I'm really happy to be here.
So can you start by telling us what led to you writing this paper?
Sure. When I was a teenager, my favorite band were the Smiths, and they had an album and a song called Meat is Murder. And that song was really life-changing and formative for me at a young age. And it had these lines, "It's not natural, normal, or kind that flesh you so fancifully fry." And I'm not sure whether that explicitly influenced Melanie Joy, who then became well known for the 3 N's. But that concept of these different reasons that people justify eating meat has sort of taken off in activism and also in psychological research. Jared Piazza, who you mentioned, found that there are actually 4 N's, not 3, in that most people say that they eat meat because it's natural, it's normal, it's necessary, or it's nice, meaning that they think it tastes good. So Jared and his colleagues developed a measure that conceptualized the 4 N's as a single dimension of moral justification, and that paper and that measure have been widely used in psychological research on attitudes about meat. My background is in personality and individual differences. I think because of that background, my colleagues and I naturally wondered whether it would be possible to distinguish the 4 N's from one another rather than thinking about them as kind of a collection of related rationalizations. Because if you could do this, you might be able to figure out what kind of people would tend to use different justifications, and that might help you with a variety of other things, like figuring out what are the causes of these different rationalizations relative to one another, or would it be possible to target advocacy or intervention based on which kinds of rationalizations people find most compelling. So across a few studies, including the one that you mentioned, we found that the 4 N's can indeed be distinguished in a psychological measurement tool, and that there are some, at least we have initial evidence that there are some important differences in these motivations. Maybe the most surprising finding for us anyway was that the natural and normal motivation were quite different than the other two. People tend to endorse natural and normal less often than necessary or nice. But also people who do say that they think that it's natural or normal to eat animals tend to have antisocial and immature personality traits. They tend to be quite self-focused. So they're the sort of maladaptive So most maladaptive reasons, I guess, among the reasons that one could have for thinking it's okay to eat animals. The necessary and nice motivations have correlates that would probably not surprise anybody. People who say that they think it's necessary tend to have a sort of traditional worldview, be politically conservative, are sort of conventional. People who say it's nice tend to be sort of hedonistic, aren't particularly concerned or worried about moral issues. So those are not so surprising. Another interesting thing that I'll mention that we found is that we found that these dimensions function in the same way in both vegetarian and omnivore respondents. So you might think, well, if you're vegetarian or vegan, then you would say none to all of these, but actually there is variance in how much vegans or vegetarians can at least appreciate these justifications for eating animals, which is interesting because it suggests that our measure or a model like this could be used to study things like craving or the temptation to return to an animal-based diet or ambivalence in vegetarians and vegans, in addition to studying motivations in non-vegans.
Well, that's fascinating. So there's a wide range of things that we can dig into a little bit more. But let me ask, first of all, how do you go about measuring these things? What's your kind of methodological approach?
Well, these are thought of as explicit attitudes, and so the most straightforward to get information about explicit attitudes is to ask people. So I think the key was in what psychologists call discriminant validity, and that means that you want two scales that measure something very similar to nevertheless be distinct from one another in factor analysis and in their correlates. And so that's a difference between the measure that Jared and his colleagues developed and ours, is that we worked really hard to try to find questions that we could ask that would be really specific to each one of these motivations and unrelated to the others. And I think that's why we were able to distinguish the two. The other thing that is important is to be able to establish that the measurement is reliable and works the way across different populations. So we collected the same measure in multiple samples, and we used psychometric techniques to be sure that the items on our scale were working the same across these different samples. That's what allowed us, for example, to tell that it was working the same in vegetarian and non-vegetarian respondents.
So these kind of tools that you're developing, that's what the motivations to eat meat inventory is. Is that correct? Could you introduce us to this framework, this tool?
Yeah, it's a questionnaire in which respondents can say on a Likert scale, to what extent they agree with different items. And they're very straightforward. So for example, on the nice scale, it might say, I like the taste of meat. On the necessary scale, it might say, I think in order to be healthy, you should eat meat. So the items wouldn't surprise anyone. It's quite explicit. And people just rate the degree to which they agree with each of those statements.
Great. And through doing that, you're able to get an idea of which of the four ends these particular respondents align with most closely. And then based on that, you're able to disaggregate them and tell us different things about different people who endorse the different ends.
That's right. And a key, there's sort of two steps to that question of like, how do we know if these things are really different? One step is internal. In the psychometric literature, we call that internal validity, and you use a technique called factor analysis to do that. So I don't want to get too in the weeds here, but basically you can use statistics to tell if you're getting 4 different things or just one thing or 2 different things. And then particularly when you replicate that across different samples and you find the same result every time, you can be confident that there are 4 things. That's challenging, of course, because the 4 things are indeed correlated. And people who say that they think it's necessary will also tend to say they think meat eating is natural, et cetera. So it's quite a challenging thing to be able to establish that there's 4 separate scales. But the second part that's really important is establishing what's called external validity. So from a personality perspective, what you would tend to do in an area like this is you would give people lots of questionnaires or measure their behavior in other ways around many different kinds of domains: personality, other kinds of attitudes, political attitudes, demographics, behaviors, and all sorts of other domains like the environment or relationships, etc. And the idea is that by trying to establish how each of the 4 scales correlate with different clusters of these other domains in ways that are different, you can start to generate an idea of sort of the profiles of people who would be prototypically likely to endorse one motivation over and against the other.
Great, and you've introduced us to some of those profiles already. One of the things you look at, and this will be familiar to people with a psychology background, are the big five personality traits, and you address how these different justifications map onto the big five personality traits. Could you introduce us to what you found then?
The Big Five personality traits is a model that suggests that at a sort of broad level of abstraction, you can distinguish people in terms of these five traits. The first is neuroticism, which is like how much negative affect, anger, depression, sadness people have. The second is extroversion, which has to do with how many positive emotions people have and how much they like to be around other people. The third is openness to experience, which is closely related to political attitudes, interest in abstract ideas. People who are high in openness tend to be more liberal politically. The fourth is agreeableness, so compassion, kindness, warmth. And the last is conscientiousness. So this is things like orderliness, obligation to duty, but also things like being on time and being sort of responsible. What we find is that in general, people who eat animals tend to be lower in openness in particular, and also lower in agreeableness. And findings are a little bit more mixed with agreeableness. With respect to the four N's, what we're finding is that the strongest and most consistent correlation is low agreeableness and those natural and normal motivations. That's interesting to us because low agreeableness is also the strongest risk factor for antisocial personality and behavior, criminal behavior, and that sort of thing. And so in a paper sort of focused on that issue, Wiebke Bleidorn and I found that it's quite specific that antisocial personality traits transcend species is how we put it, meaning that they seem to work the same for both human and non-human animals. That is, people who are not kind to humans tend to have the same propensity to not be kind to animals and vice versa. One of the implications of that to us is that being unkind to animals should be considered as a criterion for adult antisocial personality disorder, which is interesting because there's a childhood variant of antisocial personality disorder called conduct disorder. And actually, animal cruelty is a criterion for the child variant of this problem. But in adulthood, it's been taken out. So we argued that cruelty to animals ought to be considered based on that evidence.
That's fascinating. Would it be too simplistic a reading of what you're finding to say that if people are endorsing these claims, that they are likely to be less social people, that they're likely, or perhaps have a higher chance to have maladaptive psychological traits?
I mean, there's certainly not a one-to-one correlation. So it's in fact fairly common for people to believe that it's natural or normal. And in fact, if you think about normal in a concrete way, as in it's common, it's factually true that it's normal to eat animals. So it wouldn't be the case that just because somebody endorsed those motivations, they would necessarily be antisocial or psychopathic is a synonym that we use in psychology for antisocial. But it does mean that if you tend to endorse the natural and normal motives over and against the necessary and nice motives, you're more likely to have antagonistic, antisocial attitudes about humans, non-humans in general.
One of the other things you looked at is values. So there's already quite a lot of evidence that a propensity to eat meat is often tied to conservative social values.
That's right.
But you are disaggregating this to look at the different justifications as well. So what did you find there?
Yeah, I think that's what's interesting about distinguishing the four N's is that the natural and normal motivations that we've been talking about have to do with these kind of immature antisocial values, sort of it's a dog eat dog world, so to speak, kind of values. The necessary motivation was actually the one that's most consistent with what you just said. That's the motive that has to do with being sort of traditional, conservative, wanting to just go with the sort of norm. So being low in openness, being politically conservative, thinking that traditions are important to maintain. These, I think, are the people who are like, look, the reason to eat meat is because I want to be healthy, and so I eat lean meat or something like that. I think that's the kind of thing people that have endorsed this motive would say. And the nice motive, this has to do perhaps, we don't find a correlation with extroversion, but conceptually it has to do with sort of positive affect. Sort of, I'm not really that worried about moral issues. I don't want to think about it. I just like the taste of meat. And so that's the only thing I'm really worried about.
So one of the really striking things is in this study, you look at vegetarians' motives as well. So could I ask you why you did that and what you found with it?
Right. Well, one interesting thing is that the motives to be vegetarian are not opposite the motives to eat meat, which you might sort of think at first. In fact, the necessary motive has a direct analog for vegetarians, which is many people choose to not eat animals to be healthy. And so you could use health as a justification for either eating or not eating meat. And actually, the data are pretty all over the place. It's not really clear that there's major health advantages either way for human health anyway. And so one could believe either of those things and use that as a justification for what they eat. The other two are quite distinct. The most common motives in the vegetarian work are environment and animal rights. One interesting thing that we found in addition is that not only are they not opposite empirically, but they also have different patterns of correlation. So with the vegetarian motives, being agreeable and open and communal and sort of caring about the world, they predict all three of the vegetarian motives. Health is distinguished sort of like the necessary meat eating motive by conventionalism, traditionalism, thinking that self control is important, hard work. So then these are the people who are maybe going to the gym and trying to get up early, and they think that not eating meat is sort of fits in with part of that sort of life view. It's not an ethical issue for them. The other two motives didn't have very many correlates, and we used a representative sample from the Netherlands in our first work where we had hundreds of variables because we just correlated our scales with everything we possibly could, and we used statistics to sort of sort out if there was anything distinct, and we found very little. And so I think what's interesting about that is that the environmental variable has a few other correlates, mostly, not surprisingly, related to other things about environmental welfare and sort of political activism. Animal rights motives to be vegetarian seem quite specific. That is, people who say that they want to be vegetarian or are vegetarian because they're concerned about animals are difficult to identify any other way, by personality, by values, I think it's an interesting phenomenon that we might talk a little bit about later. I think one of the issues that we as a community have is that people haven't made the connection between animal rights and other aspects of social justice. And I think maybe that's one of the things that work is telling us.
Yeah, that's fascinating. And in this particular study, one of the reasons you're looking at vegetarians is to understand whether they might have some sympathy with the justifications that people put forward for eating meat. So what did you find there?
Yeah, we found with both of these measures, so the measure for vegetarian motives and the measure for meat eating motives, that the scales functioned the same way in vegetarians and omnivores. Now, that doesn't mean that the levels of the scales are the same. Obviously, the meat eating motivations are higher in omnivores than vegetarians or vegans, and the vegetarian motives are higher in vegetarians and vegans than meat eaters. But in terms of the structure of the dimensions and the way those dimensions correlate with other kinds of variables, they're same. So this is really interesting because it means that vegetarians can imagine why a person who eats meat might want to. Likewise, a person who eats meat can imagine why a person would want to be vegetarian. This may have some implications for advocacy because there's not a qualitative difference between these groups, and we're not asking people to make a qualitative shift in sort of how the underlying beliefs are organized, but maybe we're more asking people to take those beliefs seriously.
I think it's very striking that you focus on meat eating here.
Yeah.
Do you think you'd find something similar if you were looking at dairy eating, for example?
Yeah, that's a great question. I haven't done research on this myself, but the research does suggest that vegans tend to be much more likely to be compelled by the animal rights motive than the other two motives. The other thing about that motive, which I should have mentioned before, is again, this is not my work, but other people have found that's the one that's the stickiest,
Yeah.
meaning people with a health motive are very likely to go back to eating animals or to eat animals occasionally or whatever. People with an animal rights motive are very unlikely to do that. The main reason that we haven't studied vegans in particular is because they're rare. And we wanted a measure that would be applicable to a large populations of people, but that's certainly something we would like to do.
Well, we'll watch this space then. That's fascinating. I look forward to
Absolutely.
seeing what you come up with. Now, as I mentioned earlier, you're one of the co-founders of PHAIR. How did that come about, and what are the goals of the organisation?
PHAIR is something I'm really excited about. So a little bit of context. I came into this area of research in the middle of my career, and one of the things that I thought I might be useful for is to use my experience and position to help support the field in general, in addition to the work that I'm doing in my lab with my students and colleagues. So around the time that I was thinking about how I might be able to do this, Christoph Dondt hosted the Animal Advocacy Conference, and he edited a book with Gordon Hodson reviewing current research in this area that your listeners will probably be familiar with. And so I approached Christoph with the idea at that time that it was really good timing to try to coalesce the field and provide a platform for people to work together. And so together with Jared Piazza, we developed PHAIR as a psychological organization that integrates animal advocacy and psychological science from an intersectional social justice perspective. So we didn't really know how it was going to go. And so we began with a speaker series of people that we knew would be popular in the community. And we sort of asked everyone that we knew if they'd like to join. And we got a really positive response. The talks were very well attended. And then we sort of moved to the next stage, which has 3 legs. Each one of us took leadership in a different leg with significant help from Jared's and Christoph's students. So Christoph will again host the Animal Advocacy Conference next June in Kent University in Canterbury. And he'll also serve as the incoming president of the society. Jared is editing our blog, which is excellent, and he will serve as vice president of the society. And I took the lead in launching our journal, which is now online and people can submit, and we've already published 2 papers. One of the great things about our journal is that it's both open access and also free to authors because it's sponsored by the Leibniz Institute Psych Open program. So it's funded by that institute, by the German taxpayers via that institute. And so that makes it free from all of the ethical implications of working with proprietary publishers. So we've published 2 papers so far, one by Carrie Neltner and Matty Wilkes on the development of attitudes towards animals and children, and another by Chris Bryant and Anna Hancock on the moral licensing effects. So that means if I do something good, does that mean I give myself permission to not have to be so good next time around, basically? And they find evidence that no, that doesn't seem to be the case. We also have a few more papers in the pipeline, and I've been super enthused by the quality of submissions, by the energy of the editorial team, and I'm really excited about the journal. One more thing about PHAIR, there's currently a vote happening, and we will be electing our board in the next month or 2, which I think is really the sort of critical third step in the genesis of in the development of this organization, because it will bring in leadership and ideas from other scholars, allow us to be more inclusive, begin to be formal about how we operate our budget. And so I think it's really a sign of maturation of the society. So overall, yeah, I'm really excited about how PHAIR has been going in generating enthusiasm and coalescing research in this area.
I think a lot of listeners will be hearing what you're saying here and thinking, yeah, this sounds great. I want to get involved. So how can people get involved with PHAIR?
Absolutely. Membership is currently free. You can become a member at phairsociety.org. Again, the conference will be in Canterbury next summer in June. The submissions will be open, I don't remember exactly when, sometime this fall. And we're working on the best way to figure out the possibility of virtual attendance. So that's likely also to be possible. So yeah, we have a number of speakers that are up on our website, so you can check out stuff that we've already done. Our blog is active, and there's a number of really excellent posts. So yeah, have a look.
Now, Chris, we ask everybody who comes on Knowing Animals 5 quick questions. Are you ready for your 5 quick questions?
Can't wait.
Can you recall the first piece of pro-animal scholarship you ever read?
Yeah, I'm not exactly sure. I mean, I would occasionally read papers on this topic or things like the meat paradox or personality correlates of vegetarian diet before I was really directly involved in this research myself. And of course, I would read books or papers in other areas as a sort of side interest. I mentioned that there was a kind of turning point. It's actually when I became a full professor and I thought, okay, I really want to focus my career on something that I think will be meaningful. And so I made a really conscious decision to try to get into this line of work. And around that time, I read a few things just to get up to speed, really. One was Matt Ruby's paper on vegetarianism as a blossoming field of study. Another was Catherine Amiot and Brock Bastian's paper on the psychology of human-animal relations, and Nick Cooney's book, Veganomics. And all of those were sort of comprehensive reviews of psychological research on this topic at that point. And that's where I kind of started.
Can you recall the first piece of pro-animal scholarship you ever wrote?
Yeah, it was that paper about vegetarian motives. So I did that project with Wiebke Bleidorn and our students, and it was funded by animal charity evaluators. And yeah, at that point, it was pretty clear that these were the three most common motives, but people had been measuring these motives in a variety of different ways. And again, given our background and assessment and individual differences, we thought one way we could contribute was providing a robust measurement tool to assess these three motives.
And where was that one published if people want to look it up?
That's in PLOS ONE in 2020.
If you had to name one animal studies scholar who's had a big impact on you, who would it be?
I mean, there's so many. I mean, the first person that comes to mind is Daniel Rosenfeld, who's a doctoral student at UCLA. It might seem like a weird choice because you might expect the kind of standing on the shoulders of giants sort of answer. And there's a lot of giants whose shoulders I stand on, which I could have listed. But Daniel came to mind because he was there at a particular salient moment in my career. So shortly after I began working in this area, I met Daniel at a conference that we happened to both be attending, and his enthusiasm and creativity were like really infectious for me. And I think something crystallized that there's a lot of really talented, enthusiastic young researchers working in this area, and I'm in a really strong position to be able to promote their work, and that's probably going to have more of an impact on the field than what I could do in my own research. And so I think meeting Daniel was really a stimulus for me to do things like contact Christoph about organizing PHAIR and starting the journal and all the other things that I'm now really excited about.
Oh, that's fantastic. We'll have to get Daniel on Knowing Animals. It's not a name I know.
Oh, you should definitely get him. He's great.
What's the most important thing that academics can do for animals?
Yeah, I'm not sure there's a single answer to this question. I mean, we all have different skill sets and expertise, and we're all doing really interesting things. And so I guess this maybe is a generic answer from a personality psychologist, but I think we should all bring our own strengths and expertise to bear on this problem in ways that will be most effective. I mean, for my part, I hope I can use my background and assessment to increase knowledge about how to measure different constructs that we're interested in, but also my administrative and editorial experiences to help promote the work being done by other psychologists, in particular junior scholars in this area.
If you had the power to change one thing about the human-non-human animal relationship, what would it be?
Yeah, I mean, it's tempting to give something probably too idealistic, but if we stay within the realm of things that might be possible in the near future, I would make speciesism a universally accepted facet of an intersectional social justice perspective. When I was listening to you being interviewed on this podcast, and you talked about the philosophy student in your doctoral program who was like, oh, they never do philosophy. And you're like, well, I'm doing something, but it's about animals, so it must not count. I think this transcends philosophy to the world at large, or at least the sort of left at large, in that there's been tremendous progress in raising awareness about power and privilege as it pertains to oppressed human subgroups during the course of my career, let's say. And these principles that have a lot of traction and currency in those discussions logically apply to human, non-human animal relationships as well. And, you know, this connection's obviously been realized by many leaders in human intersectional social justice. But for a lot of people in this space, the issue of non-human animal rights is sort of out of mind or even antagonistic. And to me, an authentic social justice perspective means taking on exploitation that arises from power and privilege wherever it's found, and that has to include non-human animals. So I think making that connection would be the thing that I would want to see change.
What are you working on next?
We always have a lot of different stuff going on, but one thing I'm really excited about is a project we recently did in collaboration with Mercy for Animals, where we collected a cross-cultural survey of attitudes about farmed animals among about 20,000 people in 23 different countries throughout the world. We've begun analyzing data for that project and have submitted 2 manuscripts. One interesting finding that I'll just mention because of its relevance for advocacy is that there wasn't a correlation between how much animal advocacy work being done in a particular place and how much sympathy there was for the cause in different places. So there's a lot of countries in the world where people are ready to hear the message and maybe do something about it, but there's not a lot of work being done in terms of advocacy in those places. So that means that there's really tremendous potential to extend our advocacy work into the majority world. This project's also really led me to think more deeply about how advocates and scientists can work together. There's a lot of ways in which we have different backgrounds or expertise or skill sets or even motives in some cases. And so it creates a lot of interesting challenges, actually, but a lot of interesting opportunities as well. So I've been working with some people thinking about that at a more basic level of like, how should we approach the collaboration between people working in these different spaces?
And how can people find out more about your work? And I should add about the PHAIR Society.
My website at the University of Zurich has my CV and contact information. I'd be happy to hear from you. And my Twitter handle is @HopwoodChris. You can learn about the PHAIR Society at phairsociety.org or follow the society on Twitter @PHAIR Society, spelled PHAIR.
Well, thanks so much, Chris, for joining us for this podcast.
Thanks for having me. I had a great time.
And thank you, listeners, for joining us for Knowing Animals, the podcast where we talk to animal studies scholars about their work. You can follow us on Twitter @knowing_animals or on Facebook @knowing animals. You can follow me on Twitter @Josh L. Milburn or on Instagram @aveganphilosopher. Please don't forget to tell others about us, spread the word, and review the podcast on iTunes and where you found it. Reviews make it easier for others to find us. I'm Josh Milburn, and I do like knowing animals.
For more great iRaw podcasts, visit irawpod.com. That's IROARPOD.com.